okay? So we got to get to Africa. This is the data I love more than any other data in all this data I'm showing you, because it's not going to shock you now because I've already previewed it for you, but it's just, I lecture to Stanford alumni about how people view democracy. I lecture to other audiences, and people who don't know, who just look at a continent of civil war, of poverty, of a lot of authoritarian rule, who think poor people don't want democracy, that what you first want to do is have a strong hand, get economic development, lift people out of poverty like China did. Maybe someday then people will care about democracy and human rights and those aspects of human dignity. They're very surprised by this data. And I like to see people be surprised. I think it's a healthy thing intellectually. So let's ask first, what percent of the people say that they prefer democracy? When they get that question about whether democracy is always preferable. Well, there's a lot of variation. Sudan, Mozambique, Swaziland, some of the poorest countries in Africa, some of the ones with the least experience with democracy, with pluralism, and kind of democratic ideas and models from elsewhere. It's under 50%. But for most countries of the 32 that were surveyed in 2015 in sub-Saharan Africa, 32 is for all of Africa, so I've selected the 28 or so from sub-Saharan Africa to show you here. But the average is 2/3 agreeing with the proposition. And in a lot of African countries, it's 70% or higher, even in very poor countries like Malawi and Zimbabwe and Togo. And it's up to over 80% in a few, including Botswana and Mauritius, which are the two longest standing democracies in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, if you ask about these authoritarian alternatives, one-party rule, strongman rule, military rule, again, this is the percentage rejecting all three authoritarian alternatives. And remember what I said. You don't always get in the United States, and you don't always get in these other countries, like consistent, dedicated authoritarians. People are human beings. They're not always consistent in their views. And some people you keep firing. The more options you put before them, the more different ways you think of asking them, might you consider some kind of non-democratic option, the more likely it is they're finally going to break down and say, okay, I might consider that one. So you ask them three and they reject all three. It's a pretty robust test of commitment against authoritarianism, which is, at least in the Churchillian sense, de facto commitment to democracy. And the percent rejecting all three authoritarian options is, again, it's kind of middling in a number of sub-Saharan African countries, including, by the way, South Africa, which I think is something to keep in mind and maybe worry about a little bit. It's a little bit ambivalent in a lot of these more authoritarian countries, but it's well over half in Zimbabwe, interestingly, which has been struggling to get back to some form of democracy. And it's generally over 60% in a large number of sub-Saharan African countries. Now, there are, the three individual options and the overall trend in rejecting all three. And we can look at the trends in 18 African countries that were surveyed in each of the last 4 surveys, okay? Rounds 3, 4, 5, and 6 in around 2005, around 2008, around 2012, and around 2015. And interestingly, it's not been all happiness and smooth sailing for democracy in Africa. It's been a lot of oscillation back and forth, a lot of pressures, a lot of frustrations, a lot of corruption and abuse of power. But the percent rejecting all three options has gradually risen a little bit during this period and has remained, pretty steady at about 3 in 5 citizens on average in these 18 countries. And then these are the trends in the specific elements of rejecting one-man rule, military rule, and one-party rule. You see slight dips here, but there's not a substantial difference here in size, and it's kind of barely statistically significant. Okay, now we get into those value statements. Okay, using the D word or gross regime options, but what about the stuff, the content of liberal democracy? So we've got a different set of value statements than we use in Asia, but I think a good, robust test of, is this all kind of at a fluffy, superficial level, or is there really a commitment to accountability, rule of law, constraint of power, things like that? 9 items where we ask, would you rather have a government that gets things done or one that's accountable to the people? Would you rather choose leaders through elections or other methods? Would you agree that political parties are divisive, maybe we need another method, or that many parties are needed to have a good political system? Do you think the president should be monitored by the parliament or free to act to do what he or she thinks is right? Should opposition parties examine the government or cooperate with it? Should the media check the government or avoid negative reporting? And on down to a crucial one, highly relevant in Africa, should the president be limited, as many constitutions early on did, and then of course the president reaches his second term and he decides he's actually not eager to leave and tries to change the Constitution? Is that good or not? All right. Now, the more of these 9 statements Africans agree with, I would submit to you, the stronger, kind of more rounded, comprehensive, and robust is their commitment to liberal democracy. The percent of the African public in 32 countries, this includes a few in North Africa like Tunisia and Morocco, the percent who agreed with all 9 items is very tiny, 4%. Remember what I said about consistency? And often one that they didn't agree with is opposition parties challenging or cooperating in the parliament. And I think maybe that's the weakest test of liberal democracy, because even I'd say, we ought to get more cooperation in the US Congress. But in any case, 4% with all 9, 13% with 8, 20% agreed with 7, 21% with 6. Now you could just ask this, okay, if you can get agreement with 2/3 of these statements, it's probably reasonably liberal orientation, right? I'm not sure you would find more Americans who agree with 2/3 or more of these statements than you do of Africans. And you get 41, 54, 58% of the African public, on average, across these 32 countries on the continent, that agree with at least 6 of these 9 statements. I think that's a powerful thing. And this is the distribution. 81% say, I think we should choose our leaders through elections and not other methods. Strong support for presidential term limits, media checks on government, even for competitive political parties, 2/3 or more with most of these. The weakest ones are, well, would you like to have a government that get things done or ensure that it's going to be accountable to the citizens? And even there, which is putting it in a way that would kind of bias it in favor of the illiberal response, a majority of Africans say, political accountability. So the one that doesn't get much support is opposition parties examining the government versus cooperating with the government, okay? Now, we can group all this into a demand for democracy, which combines 4 measures, the 3 that reject authoritarian rule, and whether they always think that democracy is preferable to any other form of government. And we can summarize this in 2 ways. We can say what percentage of the people agree with all 4 statements. That's a high test. Or we can just take the average level of agreement. I'm going to show you both. And of course, the average level of agreement is going to be much higher than the percentage who have what's called full demand. They agree with all 4 statements. We'll take the same thing on the supply side. On the supply side, what percentage say that the country is either a full democracy or a democracy with only minor problems? And what percentage say they're satisfied with the way democracy is working? So these are the trends across these 4 surveys in the 18 countries that were surveyed all 4 times, because the Afrobarometer keeps adding more African countries in the more recent rounds. So if we're just taking the average, you see this huge gap here between the average demand for democracy, what Africans want, and what they perceive they're getting from their society. They want a clear and fairly liberal democracy, I'd say, and they perceive and correctly a declining supply of democracy. You see the same thing, but at lower levels, if you take the percentage who have, quote, full demand for democracy and consistently across the 2 items perceive that supply of democracy. So it's just a choice you can make methodologically. And the gap between demand and supply, the average level of demand and supply, is about 27% on average in sub-Saharan Africa. And it's across the 4 surveys. It can vary over time, so it's declined in Zambia. On average, it's been pretty consistent across the 4 surveys. And it's pretty high in Nigeria and Zimbabwe, much lower in Ghana, in part because Ghana's pretty democratic. In South Africa, you see here consistent continuing demand for democracy, but I'd say inaccurate under the period of Jacob Zuma's very corrupt, increasingly illiberal populist rule, a kind of perception of a plunge in the supply of democracy. Now, if you were looking at the average levels, something's wrong here. If you're looking at the full level of demand for democracy in South Africa, there was a deterioration in this, so there's a big gap between this and this. But I sometimes take this as a kind of more realistic measure here.